Hey guys, tonight we will drift back to one of the most horrifying and unbelievable moments of the French Revolution, where a woman, only because of her loyalty to her friend, had to pay the price with a death so brutal that even her executioners became a symbol of madness. This is the story of Princesse de Lamballe, the closest friend of Marie Antoinette, who was torn apart by an enraged crowd and whose head was paraded through Paris as a trophy. Just hearing it sends chills down your spine, doesn't it? Honestly. If you think you are brave enough to listen to the very end, then congratulations. You will not survive it, figuratively speaking. Of course. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I also want to know, where are you watching this video from? And what time does your clock show right now? Share it in the comments below, so we can see how many people are listening together in the dark of night. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes. Relax a little. And imagine yourself stepping into the scene of Paris at the end of the 18th century. The cobblestone streets are damp, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and the murmur of voices flowing like an underground stream that never stops. In the distance, the ancient buildings of Versailles and glittering Paris suddenly become the backdrop for a historical tragedy. And right in the middle of that whirlwind, you will see a small woman carrying on her shoulders the fate of friendship and loyalty, Princesse de Lamballe. She was born into luxury, a dreamy Italian young lady, and then entered one of the most extravagant courts in Europe. At the age of 17, she married Prince de Lamballe, heir to one of the largest fortunes in France. But, as a strange twist of fate, her marital happiness lasted less than a year. Her ill-fated husband died, leaving her a young widow at 18. Just imagine 18 years old. An age meant for balls and love poems, and she was writing letters of mourning instead. It was like a modern girl today, showing off her wedding ring on Instagram, only to change her profile picture to black a few months later. Life then was nothing more than a message-marked scene that never got a reply. That very tragedy brought her into the Palace of Versailles, a place that glittered like a dream but was riddled with traps. There, she met another foreigner, also young, also seen as different Marie Antoinette. And as you know, some friendships are born instantly, without the need for artificial social tests. In a palace full of false smiles, they recognized each other like two lost souls finding a kindred spirit. The crucial historical moment came when Marie Antoinette became queen. She immediately granted Lamballe the position of superintendent of the Queen's household, the one who oversaw all of the Queen's private affairs. This was not just a position, but a public declaration. She is my family. In Versailles, that statement was like putting best friend forever right in your bio for everyone to see. The problem was, once people began to hate Marie Antoinette, naturally, they hated Lamballe as well. And heaven knows, the people of that time were just as skilled at making up stories as today's comment warriors. Incendiary pamphlets began to circulate, painting filthy tales, accusing them of having a relationship beyond friendship. Lamballe was branded as the Austrian spy, a corrupting influence, and turned into a villain everyone could despise. It's almost laughable that a gentle, quiet, loyal woman could be transformed into a master manipulator-type character. If Facebook had existed then, Parisians would have spammed her photos with comments like, "Hide. Nobody wants you here." A strange fact few know while many nobles panicked and fled France. Lamballe could have lived peacefully in London. She already had a safe escape in hand. But no, she returned to Paris for one reason only. The Queen needs me. And so, Lamballe wrote her will, preparing herself that this journey might be one way. This is a detail historians still debate today. Some say she returned out of honor and duty. Others insist it was personal affection that nothing could shake. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, the kind of decision reason today can hardly grasp. Like someone giving up everything just to care for a friend in distress, knowing full well there will be no happy ending. Put yourself in that position in the middle of a chaotic city, crowds roaring in the streets, and you choose to walk back into the fire pit just because of a promise together until death. It shows that loyalty can be beautiful, but sometimes as cruel as a voluntary death sentence. And as expected, Lamballe's remaining days passed in the whirlwind of upheaval. She witnessed the royal family's disastrous failed escape in 1791, and on June 20th, 1792. When the mob stormed the Tuileries, she thought only of protecting Marie Antoinette rather than herself. Every time you read this, it feels as though she lived her whole life to be a shield for her friend. Compared to today, she was the kind of person willing to take on all the drama for you, while you still posted carefree stories of drinking bubble tea. Yet, like a tragedy reaching its climax, things only grew worse. On August 10th, 1792, the monarchy was completely overthrown. The royal family was locked in the Temple prison, while Lamballe was thrown into La Force prison. This was not a jail of dry bread and a few iron bars. It was a grim, damp, suffocating place where even your breath seemed to bounce back inside your chest. They said La Force was worse than a nightmare, for their prisoners lived in the daily wait for death. In that context, Paris was shaken by news that foreign armies were marching in, threatening to raze the city if the royal family was harmed. Instead of deterring them, the news fueled paranoia. The people believed that prisons were full of spies and traitors. Thus began one of the bloodiest stretches of history, the September massacres. Prisoners were dragged out and judged in lightning trials a few questions. A nod. And then, you know what followed. Lamballe was hauled before such a mock court. She was given a choice: swear loyalty to liberty and equality, and swear hatred against the king and queen. Just one sentence, and she could have walked free. But she replied, "I am willing to swear to the first, but I cannot swear to the second. My heart does not allow it." Do you feel that lump in your throat? That single no pushed her off the edge of fate. Historians still debate this moment. Some say she was too naive. Others claim she was the very embodiment of absolute loyalty. But whatever the case, it was the breaking point. A moment where history needed only a few seconds to turn someone from a prisoner into a sacrifice. By now you must also feel a strange paradox. Lamballe's entire life, from being a widow at 18 to her imprisonment at La Force, revolved around the word loyalty. And it was precisely that word that became the blade cutting the thin thread holding her to life. It was like clutching tightly a ticket to your favorite concert, only to discover that it was really the entry pass to a party from which you could never escape. And that was only the beginning of the nightmare. What happened next? When the prison doors opened, when the furious crowd surged in, was what made Paris not only the city of light, but also the city of haunting shadows. Imagine the heavy wooden door of La Force creaking open. The hinges shrieked like metal scraping against your ears. And beyond it was a sea of people screaming. The heat, the stench of sweat, and the reek of fermented wine rushed into the damp air of the prison. In that moment, you could hear every cry of "À mort," death rising like the chorus of a monstrous orchestra. And in the midst of that atmosphere, Princesse de Lamballe was called by name. She stepped forward, her face pale but calm. They say that upon seeing the heap of bodies scattered in the courtyard, she nearly collapsed in a faint. But then she stood again, straightening her simple white dress, as though clinging to the last traces of noble composure. This is precisely what historians dispute. Was it genuine courage or merely a defense mechanism? Like when you are under extreme stress and you laugh to cover your fear. Before her stood a wooden table stained with wine and blood. Behind it sat a few self-appointed judges, with no law books, only fiery eyes and the stench of alcohol. They asked a few perfunctory questions, then pronounced, "Let her be free." It sounded like mercy, but anyone in Paris then knew it was the signal for the mob outside. Free meant free for the crowd to do as they pleased. A cruel play on words. Think of it. It was like getting a text at 3 in the morning saying, "We need to talk. Everyone knows nothing good will come from that." As Lamballe stepped across the threshold, the mob closed in. One witness said she looked like a small white figure swallowed by a sea of raging men. In a flash, her long blonde hair tumbled loose over her fragile shoulders. And then, like a mournful dirge, the tragedy began. The official record confirms she was struck down by blows of pikes and swords, collapsing within moments. But worse still, the mob did not stop. They severed her head, turning her remains into a symbol to parade through Paris. A grotesque procession, amid cheers and pounding drums. What few know, a rumor spread that her head was taken to a barber's shop to be combed, Antoinette, and made beautiful before being shown to the Queen. This was likely a grotesque exaggeration of the time, yet it survives in many accounts. Historians still argue, did professional hands really touch Lamballe's golden hair after her death? Or was it only the product of a sick imagination of the era? That head, on a pike, was carried all the way to the Temple prison, where Marie Antoinette was held. The mob shouted that she must look at it. Some rumors even claimed they wanted to force the Queen to kiss her friend's lips. Many historians believe this did not happen, but just hearing the guards whisper, "They want to show you the head of Princesse de Lamballe," was enough to make Marie Antoinette faint. And you can imagine, that moment was like a nightmare shattering her soul, a wound that never healed. But strangely, it was from this that endless distorted tales were born. People embellished stories that Lamballe had been violated, mutilated, even rumors of cannibalism. These accounts spread like fake news on today's social media, shared, twisted, and turned into truth in the eyes of the crowd. Yet authenticated historical evidence tells a different story. Records still list the belongings found in her pockets after death, proof that her clothing remained intact. And here lies the important point. Lamballe's death was not an official trial, but a collective mercenary act of the mob. It exposed how a society in fury could transform a woman who was nothing more than a loyal friend into a symbol of hatred. From being a companion, she became a name that had to be destroyed. Hearing this, you feel a chill down your spine. Because this history is not unfamiliar, even in the age of social media. Sometimes, just a few lines of status are enough to turn someone into the target of communal attack. Another strange detail seldom mentioned, there was a rumor that in her final moments, Lamballe tried to keep a faint smile. Of course, no one could ever verify this. And modern historians still debate, was it truth or simply embellishment to make her into a martyr saint? Still, that image haunts many, a fragile smile in the midst of chaos. You see, this story is not only about blood and violence, it is proof that loyalty can become a double-edged sword. More importantly, it shows how quickly a crowd, once stripped of compassion, can turn into a machine that crushes humanity. I know. By now, you must feel both pity and horror. But take a slow breath. Imagine yourself sitting in your quiet room, the fan humming softly, and all of this reduced to nothing more than a distant dream. Because after all, Tragedies like these exist in books to remind us, not to plunge us into despair. Now lean back, take a deep breath, and imagine that we are entering the darkest part of the story, not because of what eyes saw or ears heard, but because of the rumors that spread after Princesse de Lamballe fell. Strangely, people rarely stop at the truth. They like to add, to transform tragedy into chilling legend, as though the bare truth were not horrifying enough. And Lamballe, poor woman, became the protagonist of a treasury of historical rumors that still send shivers today. The historical record is clear. She was murdered by the mob, beheaded, and paraded through Paris. But then, stories began sprouting like mushrooms after rain. Whispers claimed her body was desecrated, mutilated, even tales of eating the heart like some grotesque medieval rite. Yet when historians dug back into contemporary records, they found no evidence at all. In fact, there was even a list of the belongings discovered in her pocket. Proof her body was intact when it was abandoned. This is where researchers disagree. Some argue that the grotesque tales were crafted by royalist supporters themselves to paint the revolutionaries as inhuman monsters before the world. Others believe the mob had become so frenzied that exaggeration into legend was almost inevitable. Either way, Lamballe became a double victim, first of violence, then of collective imagination. Another curious rumor after her beheading: her head was supposedly taken to a hairdresser's shop to be washed, combed, and powdered to beautify it before presenting it to Marie Antoinette. It sounds like the script of a horror film mixed with dark comedy. Imagine it, a chic Parisian salon, normally filled with the snip of scissors and the scent of powder, turned into the backstage of a grotesque performance. Yet most historians agree this was pure fantasy. But you know, the more absurd a tale is, the more it spreads. No different from today's fake news, unbelievable at first glance, yet shared by millions, and the tale of the Queen being forced to kiss the lips of her friend's severed head. Dramatic, yes, but unsupported. The only reliable document notes that Marie Antoinette, upon hearing the news, fainted in horror and wept through the night. That alone was haunting enough, no seasoning required. But humans, as you see, always like to add spice. A story 90% true, with 10% invention, is what keeps it alive for centuries. Historians still argue about how Lamballe should be seen as a martyr saint of friendship, or simply a noble woman caught in history's whirlpool. Some praise her as the symbol of absolute loyalty. Others argue that it was her rigid inflexibility that led to her death. Yet precisely here we glimpse the fragility of the line between reason and heart. Imagine if she had agreed. If she had sworn hatred of the Queen, she would have lived. But then, would she still have been the Lamballe we know? One more curious note: many 19th century European texts romanticize the story, turning her into the image of a melancholy blonde maiden, like a fairy sacrificing herself for friendship. Some paintings even portrayed her with a halo, like a saint. And here lies another debate: was such sanctification truly fair? Or did it simply turn a flesh and blood person into a tool of propaganda? As I recount this to you, I realize history is not unlike social media, a true story. But once passed through 1,000 hands, it mutates, swells, gets embellished. People forget the real person behind it, remembering only the most shared version. Lamballe, from a loyal woman, became a symbol of hatred, and later, a symbol of eternal loyalty. You see, it is deeply ironic. A person in life may not draw much notice, but in death, they can become a legend, even if a distorted one. Like when you accidentally slip in a school hallway, and for an entire month after, people still retell it as the one who fell like an action movie stunt. It is unfair. But that is how collective memory works. In the end, Lamballe's death was not only a murder, but a vivid proof of how politics can consume the individual. She did not die for any specific crime. She died for the symbol people pinned upon her. And this is why her story is worth remembering sometimes. The danger does not lie in the truth itself, but in the stories people weave around that truth. Now, relax your shoulders, close your eyes, and let your mind drift with a gentle thought. Perhaps the most terrifying thing was not the mob's blade, but the boundless imagination of humankind. And it was precisely that imagination that turned a single death into a tragedy echoing across centuries. You exhale slowly, as though letting the darkness around you settle, and I will guide you into the final part of the story, the legacy left after the tragedy of Princesse de Lamballe. The fascinating thing is that sometimes a person is not remembered for what they did in life, but forever linked to their final moments. And Lamballe is a clear proof of that paradox. After September 3rd, 1792, Paris continued to reel in turmoil, but her death did not vanish. It became a deep fracture in Marie Antoinette's mind. Many accounts say that from that day onward, the Queen almost never slept peacefully again. Nightmares plagued her, and the mere whistle of wind through a window was enough to make her shudder in panic. They said the image of blonde hair falling, her friend's face on the tip of a pike, haunted her to her very last day. You might call it a kind of psychological trauma, 18th century PTSD. Only at that time there were no therapists to treat it. The next historical event illustrates this clearly when Marie Antoinette walked to the scaffold in 1793. She was nearly shattered in both body and spirit. Scholars argue over whether the loss of Lamballe hastened that collapse. Some believe it was merely one blow among many, but others are convinced that the shock of her friend's death weakened her against public scorn and enemies. Either way, the two deaths, Lamballe's and Antoinette's, are forever bound like two continuous chapters of the same tragedy. Another curious point, few notice throughout the 19th century. When monuments were built and books written about the French Revolution, Lamballe's name often appeared, but always under the shadow of the Queen. She became the loyal friend of Marie Antoinette, rather than a figure in her own right. Later, feminist scholars complained, why must history reduce her to a supporting role in someone else's story? She had her own life, her own choices, and her death shocked Paris before Antoinette ever faced the guillotine. Yet collective memory still locked her into the role of the tragic side character. You see, this is one of history's injustices. Historians still fiercely debate should Lamballe be seen as a heroine, a victim, or a symbol. Some regard her as the martyr saint of friendship and loyalty. Others argue she was merely a noble woman, blind to the times. There is even a sardonic opinion. Perhaps it was precisely her political naivete that made the crowd so ready to use her as a target of rage. Whatever the case, the image of a fragile yet steadfast woman has survived 2 centuries. Proof that her tragedy still touches human emotion. If you notice, in plays, novels, and films about the French Revolution, there is almost always a scene of Lamballe's death. From the romantic 19th century paintings that showed her as a golden-haired angel falling, to modern films portraying the Paris mob howling like a storm. Some works even emphasized fictional details, the styled head, or the Queen forced to face it, to heighten the drama. So you could say Lamballe exists both in history and in popular culture. And once again, this proves how thin the line is between truth and legend. There is one detail few notice in European literature of the 19th century. Her name was sometimes used as a metaphor. People called those blindly loyal the Lamballes of modern times, those willing to sacrifice without knowing if that sacrifice had any meaning. This too was a legacy Though a bitter one, her name became a label, a metaphor. And think about it. If one day your own name became a verb or an idiom, how would you feel? Perhaps proud, yet haunted. But the deepest lesson her story leaves lies in the matter of the crowd. Modern historians studying the September massacres often use Lamballe's case to analyze how can a crowd shift from political outrage to collective madness, from justice to bare-handed execution. The answer is usually this: when fear and hatred are pushed to their extremes. People easily forget that the other side is human too. Lamballe, once a flesh and blood individual with her own tastes and sorrows, was reduced to nothing but a symbol of the enemy. And once she became a symbol, she was no longer seen as a person, but only as a sacrifice. Do you find this familiar? Even in modern times, we still witness the storms of the crowd on social media, where one person is turned into a symbol of evil and endures thousands of insults. History, after all, only changes the setting instead of the Paris square with drums. Now, it is the newsfeed with a share button. But the mechanism is the same. People in groups easily forget compassion. And the story of Lamballe serves as a warning that we must be vigilant against that destructive force. If viewed more gently, you could also see her as the embodiment of unconditional loyalty, one friendship, one promise, and the acceptance of sacrifice. In a world where people easily unfriend over a single disagreeable post, to hear of someone willing to return to Paris to die with a friend is both tragic and a little romantic. You will see that even in tragedy, a trace of beauty flickers. And in the end, when we speak of Lamballe, we do not only think of a gruesome death, but also of the fragility of fate, of how history always weaves truth with falsehood, and of how loyalty can turn a person into legend. Notice your breath now. Slow, steady. Let your mind absorb the truth that the most frightening part of this story is not the blood or violence, but the fact that people can so quickly forget one another's humanity. So when you close your eyes, remember the story of Princesse de Lamballe is not just a tragic chapter of the French Revolution. It is a mirror for us, about friendship, about loyalty, and about both the power and the danger of a crowd. And who knows, in this quiet night, as you listen to this, you may feel your heart grow heavy, but also sense a calm seeping in. For history may be painful, but at least it offers us the chance to learn something, so we do not repeat it. Take a deep breath. Imagine yourself in the cold stone room of the temple prison, where every breath echoed back as sound. After the tragic death of Princesse de Lamballe, Marie Antoinette seemed drained of the last light in her life. She not only lost a friend, but also the one support she had, amid a sea of hatred. From then on, the fate of the Queen of France was as if submerged in darkness, where loneliness became her only companion. The days in the temple were not like the prisons you might picture from films, with neat iron bars and stern guards. The temple was an old fortress, its walls so thick that sunlight scarcely penetrated. Marie Antoinette, together with her husband King Louis XVI, and their two small children, were confined in a damp room with only a few bare possessions. Meals once lavish with silver tables and glowing candles were now reduced to dry bread, a bowl of thin soup, and occasionally a bit of fatty meat that few could swallow. Imagine this from a Versailles where banquets stretched till dawn. Now she sat at a rickety wooden table, hearing the clink of spoon against bowl, like the dull ticking of time. Hunger might not kill her, but humiliation surely eroded her day by day. The guards did more than watch. They hurled scornful looks, mocking words. Some deliberately tossed rotten food. Others sneered about Lamballe's death right in front of her, to ensure that wound never faded. A curious detail few know even in captivity. Marie Antoinette still tried to maintain her routines as a queen. She brushed her hair each morning, dressed properly, and taught her children to read, write, and pray. Historians still debate whether this was her way of keeping royal dignity or merely a mask to hide despair. But clearly, within the temple's walls, every small gesture became a battle against the slow destruction of spirit. The loneliness grew heavier when she thought of her children's future. Her son, the little Dauphin, once raised as a future king, was now mocked by guards as the child of the Austrian she-wolf. Her daughter clung to her, trembling whenever the noise of the streets echoed in. Each night, Marie Antoinette held her children close, her ears still hearing the chants outside. "À la guillotine," to the guillotine heard so often. The words became like a nightmare lullaby, drying her eyes of tears that could no longer fall. Can you imagine such a feeling? In losing her dear friend Lamballe, Marie Antoinette suffered not only grief for a severed bond, but also realized a cruel truth. If the crowd could do that to an innocent, gentle woman, then for the Queen herself, the one they hated most, no line would hold them back. From then on, each day in the temple was nothing more than waiting for a death sentence already sealed. Modern historians still argue, did Marie Antoinette change her demeanor in those final days? Some records suggest she grew calmer, even dignified, as though ready to face the scaffold with one last pride. Others insist she grew frail, collapsing in both body and spirit, and that the haunting of Lamballe's death broke her long before the blade ever touched. What is certain is the loneliness in the temple made Marie Antoinette utterly different from the image of the extravagant queen people had once despised. No more flowing gowns, no more glittering jewels, only a thin woman, trying to keep her back straight before the hostile glares of her enemies. If you listen closely, you will realize her heart no longer beat for the throne, but only out of fear for her two young children. And thus, from the death of Princesse de Lamballe, we see the bridge leading to Marie Antoinette's solitude. One death turned into a haunting. One friend lost became an unfillable void. She was locked in the temple. But the truth is, her soul was locked in darkness, where Lamballe's blonde hair and bloodied face still hovered like an endless nightmare. Imagine this. After the suffocating months of imprisonment in the temple, the inevitable finally came. Marie Antoinette, once the very symbol of extravagance, of Versailles balls, was dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal, a trial that sounded grand, but was really just a staged play to legitimize a verdict already decided. On October 14th, 1793, she appeared before the court. No more silk gowns, no more powder, only a simple black dress and a pale, gaunt face. They said her hair had turned grey, her eyes sunken, yet her back remained straight, her steps still dignified, as though, in the worst of circumstances, she wanted to remind the world, "I am the Queen of France." Imagine it, like someone stepping onto a stage for their final performance, knowing the audience will jeer, but still holding their head high. That trial was nothing more than a public denunciation. Prosecutor Fouquier Tinville read endlessly long indictments, listing every crime from extravagance to treason. They accused her of conspiring with Austria, her homeland, and did not hesitate to wield her private life as a weapon. One of the most shocking charges was the slander that she had abused her own son. At this, Marie Antoinette was silent for a moment, then gave a reply that silenced the hall. "If I do not answer, it is because nature itself rises against such an accusation leveled at a mother. I appeal to all mothers here to judge me." In that moment, the crowd that had been shouting fell quiet. Not everyone loved her, but everyone understood there was a line not to be crossed. the insult to motherhood. Historians still debate, did that moment sway anyone's heart? Or was it fleeting? But it clearly revealed another side of Marie Antoinette, not the lavish queen, but a mother cornered to the end. A curious detail few noticed throughout the trial. She rarely tried to defend herself. Instead, she carried an air of near acceptance. Perhaps she had realized, as Lamballe before her, that once history decides to turn you into a symbol of guilt, every word of defense is useless. This, too, divides Cholas. Some say she had surrendered to fate. Others see it as her final pride. Better to die in silence than beg from a hateful crowd. And then, after only 2 days of proceedings, the sentence was declared death by guillotine. No surprise. But still the hall erupted. Imagine the roar of that crowd, like a chaotic rock concert, with no melody but rage. On her final night, Marie Antoinette wrote a short letter to her sister in Austria. In it, she asked that her daughter be cared for, and confessed that she departed in calm. Some historians doubt that calm was real, but at least in those trembling words, we see the shadow of a mother more than a queen. On the morning of October 16th, 1793, she was taken to the scaffold. She wore a white dress, the mourning colour of French royalty. As she stepped onto the wooden cart, the crowd jeered, throwing things at her. Yet some said she kept her face serene, without tears, without cries. On the way to the Place de la Concorde, she lifted her head to look at the grey Paris sky, as though to capture one last image of the city she had both loved and hated. One striking detail as she climbed the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the foot of the executioner Sanson. She immediately said, "Pardon me, Sire. I did not mean to." These are considered her final words. There is something almost ironic here, a woman about to be beheaded, yet still keeping courtesy to the very last breath. Tell me, in that moment, what would you say? Most would scream, curse. But she apologized. The blade fell, and with it, a chapter of history closed, but its echoes lingered. Historians still argue, was Marie Antoinette a victim or a culprit, the lavish sinner who bled France dry, or merely a lost woman in a time of chaos? And this brings us back to Lamballe. Both of them, in different ways, did not die for who they were, but for the images society attached to them. You see, from the death of Lamballe to the death of Marie Antoinette, the connecting thread is solitude and the distortion of symbols. One was turned into a spy, so the mob could slaughter her. The other into a criminal, so the revolution could claim justice. But in the end, both were only women, with friendship, with motherhood, and with the same fragility as anyone else. Imagine you are standing in Paris at the end of that summer. The air is stifling, heavy, and above all, full of fear. News spreads that the Prussian and Austrian armies are approaching the border, ready to march into Paris to avenge King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. People whisper to one another, if the foreign troops arrive, the prisoners in the city will be released, and they will kill us from within. A rumor, as you know, does not need to be true. It only needs to plant anxiety in people's hearts, and that anxiety quickly turned into wildfire. On September 2nd, 1792, alarm bells rang out from every church in Paris. The crowd, armed with pikes, clubs, and even kitchen knives, stormed the prisons. They believed inside were traitors, spies, nobles, counter-revolutionary priests, all deserving of death. And so, prison after prison became slaughterhouses. La Force, where Lamballe was held, was only one of them. The mob's procedure sounded vaguely like a people's tribunal. They set up a table, placed a chair, had judges, and the accused. But in reality, each trial lasted barely 10 seconds. The usual question was, do you oppose the revolution? And if the answer failed to please, the result was a stab, a slash, a pike's thrust. Corpses piled up in the prison courtyards. Many witnesses later recounted the stench of blood was so strong it seeped into the walls, and for weeks after, passers-by could still smell it. Imagine, a city once famous for wine and pastries now reeking of death. A chilling paradox indeed. What few people know, some Parisians initially went out simply to watch. But once they saw the mob killing, they too were drawn in. Some gave a token blow with a stick, then withdrew, treating it as proof of loyalty to the revolution. This is what fuels historians' debates. Was the September massacre the work of a small extremist faction, or the complicity of an entire society? After all, it was not only fanatics who took part, but ordinary people, craftsmen, women, even children, sucked into the whirlpool. One strange detail amid the sea of blood. Some turned it into a festival. Accounts tell of drunken men singing and dancing around the corpses, treating it as victory. Some sat atop barrels of beer, raising toasts each time a noble fell. Chilling to hear. But it shows a hard truth once a crowd loses its humanity. Violence can become entertainment. And of course, the death of Princesse de Lamballe became the symbolic climax of the whole event. A gentle, harmless woman turned into the prime target solely because of her bond with the Queen. When her head was paraded through the streets, the mob celebrated it as the greatest victory. For those who witnessed it, it was the sign that Paris had gone too far. Modern historians still debate was the September massacre an uncontrolled accident or a political strategy. Some argue that revolutionary leaders like Danton and Marat secretly encouraged it to spread terror and cow enemies within. Others believe it was merely spontaneous violence, impossible to control once the mob erupted. But whatever the interpretation, the result was the same, nearly 1,200 people dead in just 5 days. And Paris, from city of light, became the city of blood. Put yourself in that context every time you opened a window. You heard screams and cheers. Every time you stepped into the street, you saw bloodstains still smeared on the ground. Anyone could be the next victim. If you lived then, perhaps you would ask yourself, tomorrow, that will my name be written on the list of counter-revolutionaries? And you would realize that fear was worse than death itself. The fascinating thing is, these very days of violence planted the seeds of the reign of terror that followed. If the September massacre proved that crowds could kill thousands with their own hands, then months later, the guillotine was merely the tool to legalize what Paris was already accustomed to. People abandoned the notion of a fair trial and accepted that justice could come from a single falling blade. Looking back, you see a chain stretched tight from the death of Lamballe to the solitude of Marie Antoinette to the September massacre and then to the terror under Robespierre. Each link reveals the same truth when society descends into chaos. People quickly forget that their enemies are human. And that, truly, is the most painful lesson. Take a slow breath. Let your mind drift with the hazy smoke of history. After the September massacre, Paris was like a body accustomed to the erratic heartbeat of violence. Once the crowd had tasted blood, they almost embraced it as a new political habit. And from here, we step into the other prominent deaths of the French Revolution. Deaths that, whenever recalled, draw a direct line back to the fate of Princesse de Lamballe. King Louis XVI, from throne to guillotine, on January 21st, 1793. only a few months after Lamballe's death. King Louis XVI was brought to the scaffold. The Parisian crowd gathered in massive numbers, not only to witness, but to confirm that the old regime had truly ended. On the platform, the king spoke his final words, but the pounding of drums drowned them out. Historians still debate the question: was he deliberately silenced by the drums? Or was it mere coincidence? Whatever the case, when the blade fell, the crowd roared as though it were the victory of an entire nation. A strange detail few know after the king's head fell. Some people pushed forward to soak up his blood with handkerchiefs, treating it as a revolutionary talisman. Hearing this makes you shudder, proof that faith and superstition could merge even in the most politically charged moments. And if you compare it to Lamballe, you see the similarity. Neither was killed for themselves, but for the symbols they carried. Louis XVI was the symbol of monarchy, and Lamballe the loyal shadow of the Queen. Georges Danton, the one who lit the fire, then was consumed by it. Next, let us look at the death of Georges Danton, one of the men who encouraged the September massacres. He once declared, "Dare, always dare, and France will be saved." Yet only a few years later, he too was sent to the guillotine, accused of being counter-revolutionary. Before his death, Danton raised his head and told the executioner, "Do not forget to show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." Those words were at once humorous and bitter, his final mockery of fate. In comparison, Danton's death feels like a fatal spiral. The man who once incited the mob to kill others could not escape the mob himself. And here lies the historical debate. Did Danton truly betray the revolution? Or was he simply devoured by the very terror machine he helped to build, Maximilien Robespierre, the Almighty, who also fell? And of course, we cannot ignore Robespierre, the man whose name is bound to the reign of terror. He was once called the Incorruptible, a symbol of absolute severity. But in July 1794, he too was arrested, injured in the jaw in a failed suicide attempt, and finally guillotined without being able to speak a word. Some witnesses said that before the blade fell, he stared at the crowd, as though cursing them. Some believe it was a glare of fury. Others say it was a look of pleading. Historians still disagree. But one truth stands. Even the revolution's judge and arbiter could not escape its ruthless law. The common thread and the line to Lamballe. Do you see it? From Lamballe to Louis XVI, to Danton, to Robespierre, all were victims of a society caught in a whirlpool of violence. Each one was executed not only for their deeds, but for the image they represented. Lamballe died for being the Queen's friend. Louis XVI died for being the throne's symbol. Danton died for being the orator whose use had run out. Robespierre died because his own terror machine turned back on him. An intriguing detail, few notice in less than 3 years. Paris witnessed this entire series of deaths, leaving the city nearly numb with trauma. The people, once panicked, grew desensitized. Some records show that by the end of the terror, crowds no longer cheered when the guillotine fell. They merely stood watching in silence, then turned away, like a spectacle that had lost its thrill. And this is what fuels historians' debate. Was that silence a sign of awakening, or simply exhaustion? You can sense the continuity from the isolated death of Princesse de Lamballe to the death of Queen Marie Antoinette, to the systemic executions of the terror. All were like notes in a tragic symphony, where the true crescendo was the crowd, and each individual was but an instrument forced to break. And now, imagine yourself strolling through Paris today, the city of light, of art, of cafes along the Seine. Hard to believe that these very streets once ran with rivers of blood. But that is history. It transforms beautiful places into horrific memories, reminding us that light and darkness always walk side by side. Let your mind keep drifting, as though we are not yet ready to lay this story down. For the deaths of the French Revolution were not merely endpoints, but mirrors reflecting every face of humanity, loyalty, betrayal, courage, cowardice, even cold indifference. And from Lamballe, from Marie Antoinette, from Louis XVI, Danton, or Robespierre, the branches of this story still stretch far beyond the crowd and the addiction to violence. The striking thing is that the more deaths there were, the more the Parisian crowd grew accustomed. At first, they screamed and danced around the guillotine. Later, as executions became routine, frenzy turned into habit. People went to watch beheadings as if going to the morning market. Some records note that housewives would stop by the scaffold before heading home to cook lunch. Strange as it sounds, it is very human when death repeats often enough. It becomes part of life. One little-known detail: street vendors treated this as a business opportunity. They sold pastries, to wine, even postcards printed with the image of the guillotine right at the place of execution. Just as today, you might see pop-up stores selling souvenirs at music festivals. Late 18th century Paris had its own guillotine festival. And this is what historians still debate: did the crowd truly believe they were defending the revolution? Or were they simply satisfying a dark craving hidden beneath political slogans? Comparing deaths, Lamballe and the powerful men. If you look closely, you will see the difference between the death of Lamballe and those of figures like Danton or Robespierre. Danton and Robespierre died as politicians, consumed by the very machinery of power they helped construct. Lamballe, on the other hand, held no power, wielded no sword, delivered no grand speeches. Her only crime was loyalty to her friend. The fascinating part is that this very weakness made her death a more powerful symbol. People looked at Lamballe and saw the meaningless cruelty of the mob. They looked at Robespierre and saw the mercilessness of politics. Do you see the contrast? One death exposed the dark side of friendship in times of chaos. The other exposed the dark side of power when it spun out of control. Voices of protest amid a sea of hatred. It must be remembered that not all of Paris rejoiced at the bloodshed. Some quietly left the city, avoiding the executions. Others wrote letters and diaries recording their horror. One observer of the time exclaimed, "I no longer see people in their eyes. I see only the shadow of beasts." Another overlooked fact: some guards, after participating in the September massacres, were haunted for life. Some drank themselves to death. Others fled Paris, never to return. This shows that not everyone could grow callous enough to treat violence as amusement. Historians still debate, was it precisely this hidden remorse that helped drain the guillotine of its spectacle power in the later years when memory becomes legend? You see, the more people died, the more stories were embroidered. Lamballe was burdened with endless fabricated myths. Marie Antoinette was romanticized into the tragic queen. Louis XVI became the gentle king, deceived by fate. Even Robespierre, who had spread terror, was later described by some as an idealist, misunderstood. Scholars call this phenomenon reconstructed collective memory. Society does not preserve the truth. It reshapes it according to its needs. And this makes Lamballe's story all the more thought-provoking. For while she was turned into a symbol for the mob's rage in life, in death, she was turned into a legend, filled with false details. Do you see the irony? A real person was erased twice, once by the blade, and once by imagination. Modern parallels. When recounting these stories, it becomes easy to see the mechanism of the crowd during the French Revolution is not unfamiliar. Today we still witness 10-second trials on social media, where someone is judged, shamed, condemned based on a clipped video or a blurry photo. The truth is discarded because symbols are easier to digest. Lamballe could be branded an Austrian spy, just as a modern person can be branded a public enemy. The difference lies only in the tools then. It was pikes. Now it is keyboards. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this story does not lie in the deaths themselves, but in how a community perceives, judges, and turns others into symbols. That is its power, and also its danger. So relax your shoulders, take a deep breath, and let the story carry you further, beyond suffocating Paris of 1792, because the truth is, what happened during the French Revolution, from the death of Princesse de Lamballe to the September massacres, to the guillotine devouring both king and revolutionaries, was not unique. Human history has repeated this pattern many times. Furious crowds, violence legitimized, and individuals turned into symbols crushed beneath it. From Paris to Petrograd, the Russian Revolution of 17, more than a century after the French Revolution, Tsarist Russia fell into a similar spiral. The Romanov family, once revered as the parents of the nation, suddenly became enemy number one when the First World War turned Russia into an exhausted battlefield. The people starved, soldier deserted, and the name Nicholas II gradually came to mean a burden. And do you see the strange similarity? Just like Lamballe or Marie Antoinette, Russia's Empress Alexandra was turned into a foreign spy simply because she was of German origin. The press at the time spread claims that she conspired with the enemy, even fabricating affairs with Rasputin to darken her image further. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? For over 100 years earlier, Parisian pamphlets had turned Lamballe into the sinful lover of Marie Antoinette. The climax came in July 1918, when the entire Romanov family was executed in a cold basement in Ekaterinburg. No proper trial, no defense, just a few minutes of gunfire in the night. Historians still argue, was this revolutionary justice, or merely a repetition of the so-called 10-second trials from Paris? Whatever the answer, the outcome was the same. A family erased, not for specific crimes, but for the symbol they embodied. A regime that had to die. From Russia to China, the Cultural Revolution. If we turn another branch to China in the 1960s, we find another familiar shadow. During the Cultural Revolution, millions were denounced, humiliated, even tortured to death, simply because they were branded counter-revolutionary. Professors were forced to wear tall dunce caps, kneeling in schoolyards for hours. Intellectuals were beaten before their own students. The strange thing, few note many were denounced not because they actively opposed, but because they represented the past. A teacher, an artist, a former official, all became new Lamballes in the eyes of the crowd. And that crowd, in the name of revolution, became the instrument of humiliation and destruction. Historians still debate, was this spontaneous mob violence, or a machine orchestrated by the state? The answer is complex, but the result is clear: millions of lives buried in fury. From China to the modern world. Looking more broadly, you will see the Lamballe effect, where an individual is turned into a symbol for the crowd to destroy, appearing everywhere. In the 20th century, it was visible in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, in political purges across Eastern Europe, and even in more recent events, when social media turned a person into the target of millions of condemnations. Today, of course, there is no guillotine in the square. But there are invisible pikes, hashtags, comments, snap judgments. Notice this: when a name is dragged into disgrace, people rarely care about truth, only about the symbol they have attached to it. Lamballe could be called an Austrian spy. Marie Antoinette, a foreign she-wolf. And modern figures can be labeled with countless tags, symbolized, then destroyed. The mechanism is the same, only the tools differ. Transition, from death to memory. And so, when we move from Paris to Russia, to China, and then to today's social networks, you see Lamballe's tragedy does not stand alone. It is a small mirror within a vast mirror, reflecting how humanity repeats its mistakes time and again. And here we shift into a deeper layer memory. Death may end a life, but the memory of that death is retold, reshaped, embellished, distorted. Lamballe did not only die once at La Force, she died again in the imagination of posterity, when her story was woven into countless legends. Scholars of collective memory call this the double death, a physical death and a symbolic death. And Lamballe, Marie Antoinette, or the Romanovs, all became victims of this. The real person vanishes, and only the symbol remains. Lean back deeper into your pillow. Let your mind follow the thread of the story stretching on like a spool that has yet to find its end. Because after the blades, the cheers, and the cold nights in prison, what remains is not only death. What remains is memory, memory retold, reshaped, distorted, and etched into the minds of generations. Princesse de Lamballe did not only die in the courtyard of La Force in 1792, she continues to live in paintings, in novels, in rumors, and even in modern films. You see, right after the French Revolution, the 19th century erupted with sorrowful paintings depicting Lamballe as a fallen angel. Some artists portrayed her in a white gown, golden hair flowing long, eyes lifted to the heavens like a martyred saint. The crowd around her in these paintings was no longer ferocious, but reduced to shadows, as if to highlight the absolute purity of the central figure. Yet modern historians still debate, did those paintings reflect any truth? Or were they simply the product of a time that wished to sanctify tragedy in order to wash away society's guilt? The answer is elusive. But one thing is clear. Lamballe was no longer a real person. She had become an icon. And then came Marie Antoinette, whose memory underwent a similar journey. In the 19th century, French and English literature often painted her as the sinful queen, the woman who squandered and brought France to ruin. But only a few decades later, romantic works transformed her into the tragic queen, the ill-fated woman cornered to the end. Some novels even depicted her as a great mother, holding her daughter's hand to the very last moment. You see, history does not stand still. It shifts according to society's emotional needs. When society needed a villain, Marie Antoinette was the villain. When it needed a tragic figure, she instantly became the noble victim. Another fascinating example is the Romanov family in Russia. During the Soviet era, they were depicted as symbols of a brutal feudal regime, rightfully destroyed. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the story reversed. Nicholas II and his family were canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church, their images appearing in icons, with believers lighting candles before them. Think about it. A family once gunned down in a dark cellar, now revered as sacred. Is that not the same as Lamballe being turned into a martyr saint in 19th century paintings? Once again, collective memory did not reflect the truth. But the spiritual needs of the community, art and cinema also played a large role in reconstructing memory. Recall Sofia Coppola's famous film Marie Antoinette. With Kirsten Dunst as the queen, the movie transformed Antoinette into a pop icon, young, rebellious, fond of parties, but also deeply lonely. Lamballe appears only briefly in the film, a gentle shadow of a friend, then disappears. This shows how modern art chooses the details that fit the message, not strict historical fidelity. And that very selectiveness reshapes memory again. A little-mentioned fact: there were 19th century Gothic novels that described Lamballe returning as a ghost, haunting Paris. She wandered the dark streets, her blonde hair hanging, eyes fixed on those who had once cheered at her death. Critics called this the return of the repressed. When society cannot digest its own guilt, it creates ghosts to remind itself. This is a particularly eerie form of collective memory. It does not need truth, only a symbol to ease guilt. If you follow the thread into the 20th and 21st centuries, you see this memory further reinforced by museums, documentaries, and popular history books. Each tells the story differently. Some museums emphasize Lamballe as a victim of mob violence. Others present her as a symbol of undying loyalty. Meanwhile, school textbooks often reduce her to a line or two. The Queen's friend killed during the September massacres. Do you see it? The same person, three completely different memories. Scholars of collective memory often emphasize one thing: we cannot escape this process of embellishment. For people do not just remember events, they also need meaning. And when the bare truth does not provide enough meaning, we dress it in a new garment. Lamballe thus exists at once as a flesh and blood woman, as a mirror of loyalty, and as the ghost of Europe's memory. And here, I want you to notice something gently. History, after all, is not only for us to know who died on what day, where. It is also for us to ask, why does a death haunt us so deeply? Why do we need to retell it, embellish it, and turn it into a story larger than itself? Perhaps it is precisely there that history touches the human soul, like a haunting lullaby, making us shiver, yet also making us reflect. In film, Lamballe often appears as a gentle supporting character, standing beside Marie Antoinette. In Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette, she is almost nothing more than a faint shadow of a friend, appearing, then vanishing. Yet the fascinating thing is that, despite the brevity of her role, she still plants in viewers the sense of a small circle of friendship within the extravagant world of Versailles. Critics have argued that it is precisely this absence, more than presence, that reflects Lamballe's place in historical memory. Everyone knows of her, but few truly understand who she was. Marie Antoinette, by contrast, became a pop icon. From 18th century paintings, to Hollywood films, to fashion photos inspired by Versailles gowns, her image has constantly shifted. At times she is the party queen, dressed in splendor, laughing proudly amid candlelight. At other times, she is the tragic martyr queen, gaunt upon the scaffold. And strangely, modern audiences seem to embrace both versions, for each gives them a feeling, one of dreamy luxury, the other of haunting tragedy. What few notice is that in popular culture, Lamballe is often used as a mirror reflecting the queen. She has few lines, few scenes of her own, but her presence lets the audience see that Antoinette was not entirely alone. And when she disappears from the screen, viewers feel the emptiness surrounding the queen. Just as in real life, Lamballe's death was the turning point that made Antoinette's solitude absolute. In novels, 19th and 20th century authors often preferred to romanticize the queen's final days. Some wrote that upon hearing of Lamballe's death, Marie Antoinette wept until she had no tears left and whispered, "Her death is the omen of my own." This line, of course, is not confirmed by any historical source, but it persists in literature because it is beautiful, tragic, and makes the story feel complete. You see, popular culture does not demand absolute truth. It demands a story with dramatic power. Today, Social media continues the loop. If you type Marie Antoinette or Princesse de Lamballe into Instagram or TikTok, you will find thousands of photos, edits, cosplays. People recreate Versailles tea parties with cakes and macarons. Others dress as Antoinette reading in the temple prison. There are even short videos retelling Lamballe's death as a gruesome true crime story. All of this proves that memory still lives. Only in new forms, from cheap 18th century pamphlets to 30-second videos in the 21st century. Scholars call this the rebirth of memory through popular culture. Each era takes from the past the fragments that suit its needs. The 19th century needed a martyr to praise loyalty to Lamballe, became a golden-haired angel. The 20th century needed a wasteful queen to condemn extravagance to Antoinette, became the culprit. The 21st century needs a pop icon to post and style to Antoinette, becomes a fashion figure once again. And you see, the real people are gone, only their digestible versions remain. The strange and saddening thing is that in this cycle, truth is the easiest to forget. Lamballe is not remembered for her quiet life, or for the work she did managing the Queen's household, but only for the horror of her death. Antoinette is not remembered for the letters she wrote to her daughter from prison, but for the phrase, "let them eat cake," a line she never actually spoke. Think about it. If one day social media remembered you only by a joke you once blurted out, and forgot everything else you had done, would you not be afraid? That is precisely what happened to them. So, as we sit here in the stillness of night, retelling this story, the important thing is not the blood or the death. The important thing is how people create, repeat, and reshape memory. Lamballe and Marie Antoinette, the Romanovs or countless others, they show us that history is not only what happened, but what we want to believe happened. And in this gentle narration, you can clearly see collective memory is like a wind. It can caress, or it can sweep away. It preserves an image, but sometimes, by preserving it too long, the image is distorted. Close your eyes. Let your steady breath merge with the rhythm of the tale. Now, we are no longer only in Versailles or the temple prison, but stepping into another realm, the realm of social science, where modern scholars have tried to explain what we have just witnessed, the so-called crowd syndrome. For when you look at the death of Princesse de Lamballe, you cannot help but ask, why could hundreds of people together commit such horror, when alone, perhaps none of them would have dared? The crowd effect, from Paris 1792 to modern theory, Gustave Le Bon, the 19th century French psychologist, was the first to write extensively about crowd psychology. He argued that when a person merges into a collective, individual reason is drowned, giving way to unleashed instinct. In a crowd, you are no longer you, but only a fragment of the great beast called we. And when that beast is enraged, it can do things no individual would ever dare imagine. Recall Paris in September 1792 as ordinary citizens pressed against the prison gates. Hearing the shouts and seeing bodies fall, they too were swept along. Someone might arrive just to watch, but within minutes, they could raise a stick and strike a prisoner, not out of hatred, but because they did not want to break away from the beast. Psychologists call this de-individuation, the loss of personal identity in a crowd. And this was the very mechanism that killed Lamballe. The scapegoat theory, other scholars, such as René Girard, interpret Lamballe's story through the lens of the scapegoat. When a society is in chaos, people seek a victim on whom to unload their rage. The victim must be weak enough not to resist, but prominent enough that killing them brings relief. Lamballe embodied both a woman, fragile, powerless, yet bound to the queen, the symbol of the old regime. Killing her was like venting fury on Marie Antoinette herself. If you notice, This motif repeats throughout history. In ancient Rome, traitors were thrown into the arena for lions to devour, to the crowd's delight. In the modern era, a politician or artist can become a scapegoat on social media, bombarded with abuse for a single misstep. The problem is not in the individual, but in the crowd's need for someone to blame. Psychological experiments. How easily humans commit evil. Do you remember Milgram's experiment in the 1960s? Volunteers were instructed to administer electric shocks to others for wrong answers. Even hearing screams? Most continued, simply because authority told them to. Or the Stanford prison experiment in 1971, where ordinary students were assigned roles as guards and prisoners. Within days, guards began truly tormenting prisoners. These experiments show one truth: violence does not require monsters to execute it. It only needs a context, a group, and a symbol to target. Paris 1792 was the largest real-life experiment. Lamballe did not die because of who she was, but because she was placed in the right spot, at the right time, in a collective fever. Historians debates. Of course, no one interprets the story identically. Some scholars argue that the Parisian crowd acted violently simply out of hunger, anger, and war weariness. Others insist there must have been leaders, like Danton or Marat, covertly guiding the fury into massacre. The question of spontaneous or orchestrated remains unresolved. But one certainty remains. Once a crowd has tasted blood, reason becomes a luxury. Modern connections. Ask yourself, are we truly different today? When a name is called out online, thousands, millions of comments can rain down within hours. Everyone adds a remark. Everyone lands a blow. And soon the real person disappears, replaced only by a hated sign. This is the digital version of the crowd syndrome. Instead of pikes, we use keyboards. Instead of the Paris Square, we have the newsfeed. And the result, a person crushed beneath a symbol they never chose. You see, from Paris 1792 to the world of the 2020s, more than 2 centuries have not erased this mechanism. Princesse de Lamballe is only one victim in history's endless list, but she makes us pause and ask how much within us is reason, and how much dissolves when we are swept into the beast of the crowd. You have travelled with me through a long journey, from Parisian streets heavy with smoke, to the shouts of the mob, to the damp prison rooms where Marie Antoinette trembled in the dark. You have seen Lamballe, that small woman, go from gentle friend to symbol of hatred. And you realize, sometimes history is not only to make us shudder, but to reflect on ourselves, to see loyalty, solitude, and the storm of the crowd. Now, let us close these pages of history. Let the drums, the shouts, the falling blades fade like mist, leaving only a quiet Paris under moonlight, a city with no red blood, only golden lamps sketching soft streets along the Seine. Lie down, loosen each finger, let your breath grow lighter. Believe that tonight there will be no raging crowd, no accusations, only peace. Like soft arms holding you close, I wish you a deep, gentle sleep. And if you dream, may you dream of strolling in the gardens of Versailles, hearing the trickle of fountains, catching the fragrance of flowers on the breeze. A dream with no blades, no darkness, only you, and the stillness you deserve. Sleep well.